My cousin, her granddaughter lives at Mutijulu, just behind Ayers Rock, or Uluru. She's 9 years old, she's never been to school. And that's the reality, right? And that's the world I come home and I'm trying to grapple with, okay, what is the reality? How can we actually deliver things?
Welcome to Listen, Learn, Respect, a new podcast from the National Apology Foundation coming to you from River City Studios in Meanjin, Brisbane, home of the Turrbal and Yagara people. My name is Jessica Rudd and I'm co-chair of the foundation. We're going to cover more closing the gap targets than usual with our next guests because their profession can have an impact on all of these. Targets 7, 10, 11 and 15, which we will explore shortly in more detail. But firstly, I would like to introduce Josh Creamer, a Waanyi and Kalkadoon barrister with a national legal practice. He specialises in class actions and native title. He and his wife established a new scholarship for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women studying law at Griffith University. The scholarship's inaugural recipient is Alicia George from Bardu Island. Joshua and Alicia, thank you for being with us today on Listen, Learn, Respect.
Really looking forward to it. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Not at all. So Josh, tell us why this scholarship is important to you.
I've been very fortunate. I have been a barrister now for 12 years, and so I've had probably close to 20 years in the legal profession as a student and then working in a number of different roles before I went to the bar. And diversity is really important. Diversity in gender is one area, but particularly for me as an Aboriginal person, that cultural diversity. And I see that lacking in the legal profession. I worked on a lot of really big cases, Palm Island case, stolen wages type cases, and I was interviewing a lot of Aboriginal women, and they were talking about experiences with very traumatic experiences and really difficult for me as an Aboriginal man to sit there and hear that, and not culturally appropriate as well. And I was really keen to encourage Indigenous women to come into the bar. And fortunately, two Indigenous women, Evelyn Tarago and Malia Ben, have come in the last 5 years. But I wanted to do more than that. And this scholarship, supporting Indigenous female law students towards the end of the university degree at Griffith University who have an aspiration in going to the bar, was really another way I could make a contribution to increasing that diversity at the bar and hopefully at the bench at some stage.
Yeah, brilliant. And Alicia, what impact do you have with your degree? Like, it's a double degree, right?
Yeah, so I'm studying a dual degree in law and international relations. And I, at the moment, am planning on going to the bar, and I just really want to make an impact in the spaces that Josh has also been able to, in like Indigenous rights, and just really empowering Indigenous people to use the legal system as their tool of empowerment. And I just really want to give them that access as well. So I'd love to make an impact in that way.
And before you became the recipient of this scholarship that Josh and his wife Cara have put together for Griffith, had you thought about going to the bar?
I actually hadn't thought of it. It was kind of like a dream that I thought someone like me wouldn't be able to do it. So it's been really helpful and powerful to have Josh and both Cara just really encourage me and make it a reality that I actually can pursue this. It's something that I wouldn't have thought I'd been able to. So this scholarship is really making an impact.
I guess this leads us to the first closing the gap target that we're going to talk about today, which is number 7. Youth are engaged in employment and education. How do you see the number of young First Nations people being engaged in employment and education increasing? Josh, did you want to kick off on that?
Yeah, I do. And I just want to talk about sort of my experience. So I've spent a lot of time since 2016, 2017, working across remote parts of Australia. A lot of time in the Kimberleys and the Dampier in WA. I'm regularly up to the Northern Territory as well, and I've covered a lot of these areas, a lot of places people would not ordinarily go to. And I do want to just talk about how there is effectively some people in regional remote areas really don't have the same opportunities that we do. And that's a real challenge for me. I come home after sort of 2 weeks in the Kimberleys, and I walk back into my beautiful home, beautiful family. There's a nice bed, all these things. And I feel like I live in two worlds. Mm. Some of my clients are literally living in sheds in the Northern Territory, or sheds in Western Australia in 50-degree heat in the Kimberleys. And while I don't have to worry about food for my children, I don't have to worry about security, I don't even have to worry about having a car to be able to go into the shops. And that's not the same experience for everybody. And that's really important. I think whenever we're going to deliver programs, we have to understand that what fits well in southeast corner of Queensland or southern Australia or eastern Australia might not necessarily fit well in some of these remote areas. And that's really where some of this disadvantage is really stuck. And there is a lack of opportunity in those areas. And one of the things I want to point to, and I've talked about it regularly, for example, the Northern Territory government don't deliver secondary education in the homelands or in the Aboriginal communities. It's only in the big main centres.
So when we think that we have universal education in this country, you're saying that we don't?
No, and I'll give you an example. My cousin, her granddaughter lives at Mutijulu, just behind Ayers Rock, or Uluru. She's 9 years old. She's never been to school, and and that's the reality, right? And that's the world I come home and I'm trying to grapple with. Okay, what is the reality? How can we actually deliver things? So the first one around education and employment is really the critical piece. For me, traveling across to these communities, it's actually the lack of ability to participate in the mainstream economy which inhibits people. And there's a number of things that you need. You need to have a base level of education. For example, you need to be able to read and write English. Not everyone in the communities can do that. Some people speak 5 or 6 Aboriginal languages but are illiterate and enumerate. A lot of the people I'm going to see in the Northern Territory, they're elders. They're probably over the age of 60, about 25 of them in the next 2 weeks. 80% of them are literate and enumerate. So you need those. That's one of the foundational skills you need. And then you need employment. And you need to be able to engage in the economy through employment or productivity or something where you can get a return from the time or the services you deliver. So these, this particular closing the gap target is, I think, really one of the most critical ones, because if you miss that opportunity to engage as a young person, it's very hard to get the skills you require as you get older to be able to effectively, earn an income and change the circumstances in which you're in.
Yeah. Alicia, I'm interested in your perspective. The next Closing the Gap target that we want to discuss here today is there are 2 targets, 10 and 11, which call for adults and young people not to be overrepresented in the criminal justice system. I mean, the sorts of disparities that Josh was just referring to surely are an integral part of the overrepresentation we see in criminal justice. What do you think is stopping improvement? What are the major impediments that are in place at the moment that prevent people from winding up in the criminal justice system?
I think it is largely linked to the lack of access to education. In these remote communities, because of European settlement, they were forced out here. And now, just because how it's set up, they're not able to access this education. They're not able to have good living conditions. And it just all contributes to this overrepresentation in the justice system. And I just think there's a huge link between this access to education. I think even just talking from my experience, I grew up in Rockhampton, and my mum is Indigenous, and I would just look at like people around me, like other Indigenous students or people that not in uni or school or anything, and I was just like, there's just such this disparity between our lifestyles, and it's just like a generation away. And I was just really, I think to me that really stood out, that this access to education is really important for this target as well.
And it's really interesting, isn't it? Because, in Rocky, it's a massive regional centre.
Yeah.
So the fact that you can witness that kind of disparity in a place like Rockhampton just shows how embedded it must be in other places. Do you think that people on the East Coast are sufficiently aware of what's going on in the centre?
Yeah, the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody is really the basis. I think it's the most significant analysis into the issue. And there's a lot of criticism out there about implementing the recommendations, but I'm not sure many people who make that criticism have actually read the report, because when you read it, you understand the report's in two parts. There's the first part which looks at all the causes of crime and all the causes of overrepresentation, and they are social, economic and historical factors. We know what they are. It's not rocket science, right?
The data's there.
Yeah, the data's there, and the data's continually there. But the recommendations don't actually deal with that. The recommendations deal with reducing the risk of people dying in custody. It's a complete disconnect. And there's roughly just over 40,000 people in prison in Australia, and 13,000 of those, in terms of the adult population, are Indigenous. We're only 3% of the population. We're 30% of the prison population. There's the overrepresentation there. When you actually can see the data in front of you and understand what it means, and it goes back to those social economic factors which we just haven't addressed effectively.
So what fundamental changes need to be made to the justice system in order to address this?
Look, I could get in some really big ones.
Go for it.
Well, I could talk about the European model and the more of the therapeutic type justice. And Indigenous women are the fastest growing prison population in the country. And we saw some changes in the last few years to domestic violence legislation in Queensland.
It would make stalking easier to prosecute and broaden the definition of domestic violence to include patterns of behaviour.
That has actually resulted in more women going into prison because they're seen as, now they're being identified by the police as the offender. When you start to understand laws and the consequences they have, it's not always as it seems. Now, there's some base level issues there. So, and when you look at the data for youth justice, 80% of the kids sitting in the detention centres are actually on remand. So that just means we can't find a suitable location to house them outside of prison.
Did you say 80%?
Yeah, about 80% are sitting out there on remand. And so we can't find suitable accommodation to house them. And it's a similar type of circumstance for a lot of the adult Indigenous population in prison. The stats will say that they're on generally for lower level offences. They're there for property type offences, so things like stealing and petty criminal offences. And because they don't have the suitable accommodation to be able to be bailed to, or because they don't have sort of employment they can rely upon, they're sitting out there wasting away. And so if we want to talk big picture, we do need a structural change. We need to look at, okay, if it costs us $80,000 or $100,000 a year to keep a person in prison, are we best to utilise those funds to provide them with the resources and the infrastructure that they need on the front end? It's very much like the child protection legislation. The child protection legislation says the least intrusive measures possible. Well, they never do that. And the child protection legislation says you're supposed to work with the family to support them, to stop the removal of children. And we know what the causes are. We have the resource to be able to do it. But, this whole tough on crime, locking people up, is something that governments can't quite step away from.
We're going to speak now about Target 15, which is that people maintain a distinctive cultural, spiritual, physical and economic relationship with their land and waters. And I know you've done a huge amount of work in this space, Josh. I note that by 2030, Closing the Gap is targeting a 15% increase in sea areas and Australia's landmass covered by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's legal rights or interests. How do we go about making that happen?
We're moving in a positive direction, and I know in the most recent report on Closing the Gap, that is one of the targets we're really working well towards. There is a system in place through native title, and I think there's another system which is going to be overlaid over the top, and that's around the treaty processes that the federal government's talking about, but also the state governments, Queensland, Victoria, are also making advances on in South Australia. So through the native title process, and it can be often a very difficult and long one. I think the average native title claim over the period is usually about 17 to 20 years before it's determined. But that process ultimately, if you're successful, can achieve recognition of your rights and interests in relation to usually unallocated state land, so your national parks and those types of places as well. That system could always move quicker, but I think it is effective. I was in court 2 weeks ago, and we had a determination of no native title, which is a brutal outcome for people. It means the tide of history has washed away your identity. So that's a really powerful situation to be part of and see people experience that. And I went through that.
It's a terrible day at the office.
Oh, you're sitting in a room with 40 people, and a lot of them you have a significant amount of respect for because what they've achieved in the community and on a national level, some of them. And to feel the emotion and to understand the hurt, well, that's a moment that will always stay with me. And I've seen that now with 3 different groups. But generally, through the native title process, title claims have resulted in positive outcomes generally through negotiation with the state, and so that recognition is important, and the framework is there for that to happen. I think what is also very exciting is the work that will happen in the treaty space, and that is Indigenous groups who are recognised as having interests in relation to land, not necessarily in the native title process, but it may be. But sitting down with governments and working on a partnership together to be able to have those things recognised formally. So there is some really good work happening in there. It's happened over a long period of time. It has momentum, and I think things do look positive in that space.
What does recognition of native title mean to First Nations Australians? What does it mean? Because you touched on that a little bit, but I'd like to kind of delve into that.
There's a couple of parts to it, and firstly, in a legal sense, it's recognition that firstly your ancestors belong to that country, and you have continued to practice the culture that they have practiced over the 5 or 6 generations, because we work from that sovereignty period. So that's the continuity element. In validating people's beliefs and their experiences, you can't place a price on that. That's hugely significant in the context of what has happened in our history. So people having that link and having the federal court actually here's a decision to recognise that. The practical part of it is not necessarily ownership to land, but rights and interests in relation to land. So having the right to go and hunt, to teach, to have ceremonies, to take young people on there, show them the country. That's the practical application of that type of decision. But there is, as I say, a very significant emotional aspect to it, which we just could never value.
Alicia, I want to talk to you a little bit about the scholarship and how and what it does for you. I know that it's not just about cash, and it's actually also about access and connections and networking. Can you talk to me about how Josh and Kara's initiative has helped you in that space and what it's done for your career so far?
Yeah, I would probably argue that the more valuable part of the scholarship is the mentorship and the networking. For example, just after I got the scholarship, the Honourable Justice Lincoln Crowley was getting appointed.
The 133rd Judge of Queensland's Supreme Court, but the first Indigenous one in all of Australia.
In the end, justice is what it's all about. Always was, always will be.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah, and Josh brought me along to the appointment, and just through that I was able to make so many connections with barristers and judges, and even from that I was able to secure a position as the research assistant for the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And even then, Josh has been so valuable in just introducing me to anyone that he thinks would be valuable to connect with. And it's just, law really is all about those networks and those connections. And especially for someone like me, I didn't grow up with lawyers and barristers as parents.
Yeah.
Lived in a regional town, coming to the city by myself. So it's really just so valuable and powerful that he's been able, and Cara have been able to provide that for me and for the other recipients as well.
So it almost enables a kind of mentorship that that goes with you and walks with you along your journey in the beginning of your career.
Yeah.
Is there an area of specialisation that you kind of want to lean into at this point?
I'm definitely interested in just Indigenous, like human rights, that kind of area, but I'm still figuring it all out, but definitely passionate about helping in that space as well.
Oh, it's terrific. It must be amazing for you, Josh, to hear that and to see that the kind of idea that you and Cara cooked up one afternoon has just come to fruition in this way.
Yeah, two things I want to say. Firstly, you need to try and replicate what happens for people who do have lawyers in the family. So, you know, those conversations that happen around the kitchen table or at family barbecues because you've got that network. So that's what we've tried to replicate, because that is actually the most valuable thing, the mentoring and those relationships with people who support you. And the other thing is Alicia's really downplaying her capabilities. I was telling her this morning she could easily be on the High Court. So, it was really it's pretty special to see these amazing students coming through who are just excellent academics, you know, in terms of their academic results. These are really passionate, dedicated, big personalities who can go on and achieve something, and you know, hopefully planting that seed that, yeah, you know, I want to go to the bar, or I want to go to the bench, or I want to go to the High Court. Like just empowering people to believe in that in themselves.
I'd certainly like to see Alicia on the High Court.
Yeah, I could picture myself appearing in front of her one day. Hope she takes it easy on me.
Let's hope so. Nah, you wouldn't go easy. No, absolutely not. You know what he's capable of.
Yeah.
I want to ask you a question I haven't asked anyone else in this podcast so far, both of you. Are you sick of being asked for your opinion on The Voice?
Two things. I was at that point, but then I got to the point where I was like, I want to make my contribution, and people want to hear what I have to say. I was at NAIDOC in Musgrave Park recently, and people were coming up to me asking me, and they asked me, that's really important, that people, you know what, Josh, what about this voice? And you realise you actually have information and can interpret that information, because a lot of it's legal in a way, and synthesise it for people in a way that they'll get across the issue quickly. And so I've been more active actually in the more recent period than I was earlier, because people want to hear what I have to say, but I think it's also important, and a lot of the public speaking I've been doing is actually more for the local non-Indigenous community. They want to actually be able to have something tangible and say, all right, well, I sat down, I listened to Josh Creamer for an hour, and you know what, there's a lot of things I never heard before, and he convinced me. And it's not necessarily I'm out there trying to convince everyone to vote for it, but I'm telling you the reasons why I'm voting and what's important for me.
So it's almost empowering non-Indigenous Australians to have the conversation where they feel like they have a degree of fluency, and your contribution is to just give them the language they can use in navigating those discussions in a respectful way.
That's right, and I think what really has the missing piece, and you know, the sign saying yes and the screen grabs are great. On this issue, I've found people really want content. They really want to. They've got questions in their mind. They want to have those things answered, and we actually, you know, we all need to get out there and to share that content, because that actually is going to be the determining factor. I don't think it's going to be like a political campaign where you vote red or you vote blue or you vote green. It's like, actually, I want to think about this. That's what I've tried to do.
What do you reckon, Alicia?
Yeah, I think it's important to ask like your Indigenous friends, Indigenous family about, oh, what does this mean? Especially if they're in the legal profession, because they probably have a bit more of an understanding. But it's also important, I've said to my friends, like, to educate yourself on what, like, just don't rely on what I'm saying in my opinion, but actually have a look into the issue yourself. Don't just go and vote blindly. Actually be aware of what's happening. Like, I don't mind talking about it. I don't mind giving my insight on it, but I'm not saying that's what the answer is. I think it's important that people actually look into this issue, look into the impact that will or won't make, But yeah, I just think it's important that people are educating themselves on the issue as well.
And do you feel like you've got a bit of voice fatigue at all, or are you okay?
I think a little bit.
Yeah.
Probably not as much as Josh, because he probably gets asked more than me. But yeah, it's a bit tiring when you're just at a social thing and someone's like, "So, what are your thoughts on The Voice?"
It's interesting, isn't it? Because you think back to the marriage equality debate, and a lot of my gay friends got really sick of being bailed up at barbecues and asked, "Oh, would you get married if you could get married?" And
yeah,
I mean, it's like such a hypothetical question, and I can just imagine that, you know, there'd be plenty of kitchen table or other conversations that you guys are having, barbecue conversations, which is just like, seriously, you're going to ask me again? Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is a lot of that. But I was feeling that early on, honestly. I was like, can't I just cook my sausages in my own house in peace? But then I realised, and I think it's maybe more that it's, there's the stats are saying it could be in the balance. I feel like, well, I want to get out and make my contribution. I don't want to look back and say, oh, should I have done this? Yeah. Should I have said yes to this and gone and spoke at it? Like, I really want to make my contribution. And if it's not successful, I feel like I can still feel like, well, you know what? I gave it my, the best I could.
So what's next for this scholarship? What's your vision for it? And what do you want to see happen?
Well, the best thing we did with the scholarship is we partnered with Griffith University. And the good thing about Griffith is they've always got the ambition of taking over the world. And we're starting to have these discussions about making it the premier, Indigenous law scholarship in the country. So we set up the scholarship. Our first goal was to raise $25,000. We're up, and we thought, okay, we can do that. And we're up. That was close to 2 years ago. We're up around $200,000. So we are just sitting down with the university at the moment and saying, where to next? How can we sort of spread the opportunities that we're starting to create? And so we're actually walking through that process. So it's really exciting. It's really exciting to see people like Alicia and Keely, who's this year's recipient, but it's also exciting to think, well, we could actually have a really broad reach with this. Griffith, the great thing about the university is it's got the highest number of Indigenous graduates of any university, I think, in the last year or two, but also it's got something like 67 undergrad lawyers. There's only 200 Indigenous lawyers in the profession in Queensland, so, we get 10% of that each year coming to the legal profession. We start to make a really big impact. There's only 5 Indigenous barristers in Queensland, so we can actually make a significant change in getting those through to practicing in the legal profession as solicitors, as barristers, and hopefully going on to the bench.
I was just talking the other day and I was just like, I can't wait till I'm able to be like someone like Josh and like giving back to even like the recipients that are coming through. I want to also be like mentoring them and helping them through. I think that's kind of their vision as well, was to create this network within us as well. So I'd love to give back in that way. I've always had a dream of like setting up a scholarship or something like that as well.
Well, you're taking it over, actually. That's our plan. You're taking it over in about 10 years. And the other point is, in about 5 years' time, you're going to be like, oh, Josh, why did I ever think he was so good? So,
it's all right. You can punish him when you're on the high court.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, Alicia George, I look forward to seeing you on the High Court in the very near future. And congratulations on being the first recipient of this scholarship. You're a very worthy one, and I love watching your career and seeing where it takes you.
Oh, thank you.
And it's just been great to have you on. And Josh Creamer, keep fighting the good fight.
No, it's great to get on. It's great to be able to sit in the room with amazing people doing great things, and it really energises me. And to see people like Alicia in particular coming through in the future, wow. Look out. If this is a type of Indigenous talent that is out there, we've got a really, really big future ahead of us.
You can follow Listen, Learn, Respect in your favourite podcast app so you don't miss an episode. On behalf of the National Apology Foundation, thanks for joining us.